Well, welcome back to Humble Hang. We are your co-hosts, Shuchi Rana and
Ritesh Patel?
wonderful. Yeah. I'm so glad I got to do this with you, Rita.
You do indeed. You and John go way back, so I think this is a great conversation. I'm going to be an innocent bystander and chime in now and again, I think. So let's see how it goes.
Well, today we're joined by John Licata, Director of ServiceNow Futures. Well, excited to dive deeper into that, John, but you're the bridge between the future and the now. And how does one get to do such a cool thing?
Yeah, do you have like a time machine or something?
Yeah.
Maybe a watch that sort of speeds you up or something.
It's funny. I think people who know me know I always referenced a DeLorean from Back to the Future, and I think historically in my career, having the ability to spend 20 years on Wall Street and being able to touch on energy markets, equity markets, look into fixed income and treasuries, and really understand like how market moves has been something that I felt compelled since I was a child. So that DeLorean and being able to also look to see what comes next has been a blueprint of my career. So happy to be able to bring some of the findings of the DeLorean to this humble conversation.
That's wonderful. And so now we've been colleagues at two companies, or SAP and ServiceNow, and I'm glad I got an opportunity to closely collaborate with you. But was there a moment when you realized you were more interested in what's to come next rather than simply operating in the present? Or
yeah, I think I grew up in a house that was built on Wall Street income. Whether it was my dad traded the Italian lira back in the day, the German Deutschmark and the British pound. And it was always interesting to hear stories of how when an economic indicator came out, how markets could move. And so at an early age, I really started thinking about, market occurrences because it was how I was brought up. I was really interested in how disruption influenced global markets. And so it was those learnings when I was a kid that quite frankly, I think, always injected this enthusiasm to really understand, well, now what? Well, where do we go from here? Like today, that works great, but what if there was another disruption? And then how do you correlate that over global markets? That's something that I felt like I grew up with, and I just accelerated as my career matured.
absolutely. I think it's such a great skill, and almost every disruptor or innovator could perhaps, there's some lessons in there. So is there a framework that one follows, or is this more intuition? And yeah, what are some of the what's the foundation of it?
Yeah, I think always trying to understand, like, look, foresight in my opinion, is something that takes time, it takes experience. And I think that it's incredible when you can actually break down signals that can move a market, signals that you might be able to think through of how does a signal turn into an insight? How does an insight turn into a proof of concept? How does a proof of concept actually go to a market or maybe influence a product roadmap, a strategic investment? So it all starts with, I think, the ability to look around the corner and recognize that signals are different. And I think, so that's where you start. I could tell you, I'm always reading. I'm super curious. And I do think there's so much happening in the world. Things are happening very, very fast, but it's learning to read between the lines of signals that I think are very important. And clearly seeing how markets react to certain press releases, announcements about new innovation. It's really interesting to kind of feed the machine, if you will, and kind of understand what's people's reaction to news. And sometimes it's the ones with a zero reaction, maybe that maybe spike my interest because I always want to know why. And sometimes they turn into be a really loud strategic opportunity, but the market misread the signal. So I guess if you gave, 100 people 100 signals, it'd be interesting to see if you all had the same sort of bias. So I do think my background on Wall Street definitely helped me understand the pretenders from the contenders of how to look at what makes sense and what might be something that might be interesting, but not something that we want to spend time on.
But I think you've touched on something there, which is curiosity. I think, I was working in the 80s during the boom, and I remember one guy talking to me one day about the signal he was watching for in front of the Lehman Brothers building was the number of pizza deliveries that happened at 1 a.m. If there was a lot of pizzas being delivered, there's a big deal going down.
But it's interesting. I mean, if you remember, back in, maybe not too long after that, where there was the briefcase signal from Alan Greenspan.
That's right.
How thick was the briefcase?
Yeah.
Before he was
Yeah.
going to make an FOMC, interest rate decision. So I think, people have their own. I think some are kind of wonderful when you think back that they're accurate. But I think, the one thing that I think is very interesting is it's okay to be different. It's
Mm.
okay to interpret things differently, and whatever signal works for you, I think that's where you need to gravitate and build upon.
Do you think experience and has made your intuition and the ability to read a signal better over time? Like, is there?
Absolutely. And again, I'm going to come back to 20 plus years on Wall Street. I think, when you have to make decisions very quickly, and I think that also helps kind of the processing that goes on, at least in my own head, of is it interesting, is it not? And I think that beat from Wall Street has been something that experiences I definitely translate into that strategic foresight. For many years, I had the opportunity to speak live on CNBC and Bloomberg and be put on the spot. And I think that the ability to be put on the spot also was something that I feel like that really helped kind of hone in on, maybe information that was relevant versus, information that was just a good to know.
Do you think, there's so many people who claim to be futurists, and I get frustrated with some of them because they're just regurgitating things. I follow this one guy who's looking at, medical devices, and I'm like, yeah, I know where that's going because, you're the only one who's actually taken it apart and done something with it. Do you think the futurist term or a future strategist or whatever those terms are overused a little bit these days? And it wasn't the case 10 years ago even, right? But everybody seems to be a futurist at the moment.
Yeah, I guess I'll push back on that a little bit. And to your point, maybe that there's some folks that say that and they carry that business card, if you will,
Yeah,
but can't back that up. But I
yeah,
think, especially here, like at ServiceNow Futures, we're assembling futurists with experience that
interesting.
can actually look into different dynamics. It is a global team. It's a team that's focused. And so geographically, having the ability to lean in. Why is that so important? The geographic footprint is changing from a governance perspective. Like we
Mm-hmm.
need that experience. Certain people are very good when it comes to, say, robotics. Some
Hmm.
people may be
Hmm.
good at looking into quantum, like my particular focus. And I think that's really interesting is because I think of, sometimes a futurist is seen as a jack of all trades. And
Yeah.
in some cases, it does make sense. But I do feel like you can't just take a course in 24 hours or even an hour and all of a sudden get a certificate and claim to be a futurist. That's the part I think, I certainly can see your point and agree with.
Yeah.
But I think that, you know, maybe titles have evolved.
Hmm.
I think strategists, foresight,
Yeah.
futurism
There
have
you go.
converged. I think it actually has converged, and I think maybe that's why you're starting to see more of that. But I do think the ability to look around the corner is more relevant today than it has ever been. I think businesses, while they're focused in on, say, AI, the C-suite can benefit by having the ability to look at multiple future pathways so that we can think about strategic allocation of capital,
Mm.
human capital, financial capital, like understanding what comes next. And also, I've said this a lot in my career. I don't believe any company can become future proof, but I do think that companies should be future ready. And that's where I think the futurist role, the foresight, the strategic nature of that is influential to a C-suite as decision makers. Even, Suchi's background in ventures, at two major enterprise companies, to be able to share where we believe that we see a market going. And by the way, it's not just, hey, we think a market's going there and we're done. There's intense research that is done. There's a lot of simulation that we even do. Imagine this, and if this, then that. Like we have to think like that and think of these potential scenarios. But I feel like that's more valuable because we live in a world that's evolving so fast. What used to be horizon 1, 2, and 3 isn't really 3 horizons anymore. We don't have the opportunity like when we were maybe earlier in our careers, have a business plan, 5 year,
Right.
10 year. Now it's like you have to have, that 12-month business plan could be outdated in certain markets. So I think having the
Hmm.
ability to see signals, look across and interpret it, and have views on multiple outcomes, I think is more important than ever.
Yeah, lots to unpack there, but I do have a follow-up, and then it's also a good segue to diving deeper into the quantum topic. But who do you think, from when it comes to a large enterprise, and listening has been one of the themes across all of our conversations, who are you listening to in addition to the signals that you're seeing in the market? Are customers playing a key role in that listening? Like who else? Who else do you where
Yeah,
are
I
the
think that's
signals?
a great.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you could look at various tiers of signals, some coming
Mhm.
from the press. I think some
Yeah.
of it is technology announcements. Some of it is government mandates. You mentioned quantum, like we just saw just a few weeks ago where the United States made $2 billion in investments and showed them different modalities that it was looking to take an agnostic approach. That was a big signal that we need to unpack the different ways that quantum could be relevant. So that's just like an example. Listening to the customers, listening to their pain points, see, understanding the voice of the customer. It's one thing to just allow them to, talk about a pain point, but really like what keeps them up at night? Like, is there a problem that we might be able to help with? So it's good to get that bilateral conversation going with customers and partners alike. There's opportunities, I believe, where people tend to feel that the signal has to be addressed by one party and one party alone. Where I think that in today's world, it does make sense to look at how partners can come together to deliver better outcomes. And so co-innovation becomes important. So the signal comes from many different places. I think, as I mentioned, I read constantly. I feel like, believe it or not, I think social media has a lot of great, quick sort of takes on news that's happening globally. I mean, I feel like my first, when my eyes wake up in the morning, I'm consuming, so much from different social platforms to understand what happened overnight or what's happening today. And I think that collectively, all those different viewpoints and signals are really important as we think about what are we going to do with that? How do we act on that? With whom and when? I think these are just questions that, I think, the more we can hear from the group consensus, it's the easier to sell, a solution where people feel like there's a need for it.
I think you've touched on something really interesting there. Back in the 90s, there were a trend of companies creating what they call trend spotting, right? There was a couple of
Mm,
them that came out. I think
sure.
Piers Falk had one where he had all these people all over the world looking at trends that are happening in their local markets and pulling it together in a report. But now you can get the same thing if you just browse X, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and you can start seeing the trends happening in the memes, right? So a lot has changed in a way where before those were domains where reports were created, put in a nice package and sold to corporations as a trends report on an annual or a quarterly basis. Now you can do it on a daily basis, right? So
Yeah.
how
And
does that change your behavior?
and looks adapting with the times. I have two
Right,
young children
right.
at home, and they
Yeah,
use some of the platforms that you mentioned. And there are benefits to
yeah.
certain tidbits that maybe come across faster. Not everybody always has the time to read a 20-page white paper. I think really is, it's great to be able to find new ways to consume. And to be honest, sometimes a short little video clip goes a long way than the deep dive because it
Mm,
resonates visually. And I think the fact that
mm,
we have all these new mechanisms to play with to deliver content is is great. Clearly, there's ones that I think are, I try to keep my kids off of, but I
yes.
feel like there are, I think, a lot of good ways to interpret information, and I love the multimodality nature of that
Yeah,
because
yeah.
we all do consume information differently. So why not try the different means to deliver, research and foresight and make sure that you're hitting people where they actually want to see it.
Yeah. But there also seems to be a lot of noise. So I'm sure that's where kind
Absolutely.
of your experience and gut and intuition comes into play as far as making sense of it all and filtering all the noise out, right?
Look, it also helps I'm a New Yorker, Suchi,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
So I'm cynical by nature,
Yeah.
sorry,
Question
but I'm just being
everything. Yeah.
but to your point, yeah, I think that's part of the ability to the sniff tests. I mean, I think we all have, ways where, act now, like hurry now, like this is the latest and greatest. Like you kind of understand repetition of maybe some ideas that, yeah, you're quite skeptical about. So
Yeah.
I think, we've all, I think we, and I think that there is the intuition, the experience that goes into that. And I think in my own domain in quantum, I mean, there are a lot of people saying that we can achieve X, and what we need to make sure is ideas have been validated. And we do try to do that. We do it ourselves. We work with our research team. We try to work collaboratively in the sense that, an idea sounds good, but there's that signal, but we need to make sure it actually, what's the market for that? Like, what are customers saying about that? But sometimes when you do come across people who can't answer like
Mm.
basic questions about the market that they're trying to sell you, then you should probably pass.
Yeah. I have so many questions that's follow-ups, but we'll move to one of the more important topics for today, which is quantum. And so you're a deep expert. When was the first time you realized that this would be a thing of the future? And then what got you interested? And for someone who does not necessarily, they've heard the term but don't necessarily fully understand it. How do you explain it in simple terms?
Yeah, I mean, it's really science fiction to a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, some days it is to me as well.
Yeah.
So
Mm.
I try to navigate that. But, over 5 years ago, when I was focusing increasingly on security, just understanding the role of agents and the potential for agents to balloon, and understanding, we need to figure out ways to manage this. And certain problems are classically challenged. Managing and orchestrating, several billion agents is definitely one of those. The ability for fraud detection in a modern age of cyber threats, like understanding how we might be able to mitigate that. I also think looking into complex problems like personalized medicine. I remember doing research on a report that we had published at ServiceNow and thinking about how do we deliver this medicine of the future? Like, what could that look like? And so, we're still trying to navigate climate change. Like, there are problems fundamentally that are still around. Like, cancer has not been cured yet. There are
Yep.
things that we need to look at and understand, can combinatorial intelligence help deterministic outcomes? That's fascinated me for several years. And so the fact that I was already, very involved in security, seeing, signals that, government mandates were going to evolve post quantum cryptography, understanding that, what the insider threat is something that most people don't recognize, but the insider threat today is actually far greater from an agent than it is a human. And that was backed by the World Economic Forum. And so seeing the world was changing, understanding that we need to find in a truly autonomous world the confidence and trust in decision making, I wanted to understand how quantum can work with AI, not be mutually exclusive. So I've been fascinated for years about the convergence, whether I was at SAP or here at ServiceNow. It's been something that has been very near and dear to my focus on a daily basis. What does that look like, this convergence? And for someone who maybe doesn't it maybe is not as familiar. Quantum computing is a new type of computer. It really is, like, if you could think, it's designed to solve certain problems that are too complex for even the most powerful computers today. So instead of thinking of just faster, it thinks differently. And so while AI helps make predictions, quantum helps optimize decisions. And I feel that's so needed today. And so that's really how I really started, further unpacking not just quantum from understanding the different modalities that are out there right now, but what's the business value in this? Like, how could we translate this topic for the C-suite? Something that we're really, we've been getting great feedback in is to kind of break the barriers down from what science is able to do and bring it into the enterprise in a way that people can understand. Because to your point, I think people hear quantum, maybe the initial reaction is not favorable, but when we start to unpack the potential, I think
Mhm.
it's really something that, like most people won't like recognize quantum on their laptop, but if they could see that it's really like that invisible layer, like Wi-Fi, like we're speaking right now, but Wi-Fi made that possible. Can it just improve many of the systems that we depend on every day? That's kind of what I've been looking into, is to kind of understand, to break the stigma. And I will say this, over a decade ago, I was talking about nuclear energy, and there were much stigma about the source of radiation. And I
Yeah,
do
that's right.
feel like in many parallels, we have that same stigma in quantum, and quantum, definitely there's an educational component that needs to happen. And that is a signal. I mean, when you see that people are struggling with AI right now, what is going to lift people to think about how does this apply to me? And in my business, I think that's where, we're trying to understand that maybe the average person won't necessarily care about, something being quantum, but if they knew it could cure diseases faster, it could lower costs, improve security, and solve problems, then I can understand, like, wow, then I will get interested. And that's the kind of difference that I'm trying to bring in, is demystify the topic and also understand and unpack the value in it.
Sounds like there's some big, huge topics that could actually take advantage of this computing power, like curing cancer, drug discovery for cancer, for example, or some of the climate issues we're facing, right, around the world. We're going to have to start worrying about where people get their food from, because there are
Absolutely.
areas of the world. So quantum could really help in those categories, I suspect, right?
Well, Ritesh, I think with that, Liz, the age-old traveling salesman problem that I think people need. So actually understanding, like, how do I get to a certain route at a certain time faster? And I think, like, to your point, like the food and supply chain. I mean, look at the issue we just had recently here in the States, that you couldn't eat,
The
vegetables because they
lettuce,
were
yeah,
contaminated. And,
yeah.
I mean, my wife changed our eating habits, and it's so fast around here. And, I think, jokes aside, I think that, there are applications that need to be improved that classical
Mm,
computing simply struggles with. Quantum will not work for
mm,
everything. And in some cases, I'd be
yeah,
great if the listeners understand that quantum is in some cases slower than classical computing, but it depends on your problem set. And sometimes it's
yeah.
okay to be slower and more accurate. Would you like an autonomous enterprise that's 78% accurate? I think
Interesting,
you would want the decision making with more confidence. And I think that's what we need to get to.
interesting.
Just a quick follow-up. Where do you think we are from on the adoption and maturity curve for where people understand the value? Like, are you seeing real use cases that are leveraging quantum right now?
So I am. I mean, BMW and Mercedes-Benz and Rolls-Royce were into like battery optimization. They
Uh-huh.
were able to use that. You have Cleveland Clinic's able to look at the future of drug discovery. You are seeing opportunities, but I think there's still a long way to go. And I
Yeah.
think much how like ChatGPT, that moment where people like AI, it became a household, letters. I think mistakenly people are waiting for that quantum chat GPT moment, but I feel like the industry has been challenged with that for over 2 decades. But rather than just look at the use case, I've kind of made it my mission to look at the architecture that could allow the use cases, whatever they may be, to work. So redefining hybrid work from working from home and working in the office to working across quantum and classical systems. That to me is really the redefinition of the future of hybrid work.
Fascinating.
It's amazing. Well, do you have any follow-ups, Ritesh? Or I can.
No, I mean, I could go on for another
I
2 hours
know, I
here,
know. Well,
I
maybe
think
we'll.
what we need to do is we need to do another visit with John here,
Yes.
specifically around these topics, because it is fascinating. You're totally spot on. I think quantum has had this tag of being super expensive, super, cumbersome, and that only one or two companies in the world can afford to use quantum computing because it's something that's big and hairy and doesn't know what to do, right? And demystifying that alone is a bit of a challenge, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, Ritesh, just really quickly. There's been so many hotbeds that are emerging around the world with quantum, and France has been
Hmm,
doing amazing work on that. You're starting to see
interesting.
Italy do work in that. Here in the States, whether it's Tennessee, Massachusetts. I just heard Governor Healy spoke and endorsed quantum. Here in New York, the governor allocated several $100 million to Stony Brook University. Like NYU is growing their quantum lab. It's
Yeah,
fascinating to
yeah.
see these pockets. Maryland doing really great things. I'm only saying that is because I think the one of the signals is like, where is the money going? And you're starting to see publicly traded companies that are in the quantum space. There are funds, there are rounds being done by companies that are still private. You're starting to see a buzz, but you're also starting to see advancement. But the industry has to be able to deliver the scalability from the enterprise scale to really be successful. It's not just okay to get a white paper and your solution works. Scalability and reliability is certainly going to be a huge opportunity going forward. So, thanks for allowing me to chat with you both today. It's definitely a lot of fun.
No, I think we need to continue this, Suchi. I think there's a whole topic around just future and how companies should start talking about being future ready,
Mm-hmm.
which is a great point you've made, John. And then the second topic I think we should just do another one on is around quantum and some of the benefits. Here are some of the great things quantum can use case, not necessarily use case, but I really believe that this capability could help us and humanity in general. So we should explore that.
Yeah, I feel like we're
Completely
barely
agree.
starting to scratch
Yeah.
the surface. But
Thank you, John. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. And we're going to take you up on following up on those two conversations, I think. Right, Suchi?
absolutely.
I'd love
Yes.
that.
Really appreciate you taking the time to join us, John, and all the insights.
Thank you both so much. This was
Amazing.
definitely a lot of fun. Looking forward to
Great.
staying
Thank
in
you.
touch.
Amazing. Thanks for the education.
Okay.
Have a great day.
You
Thank
as well.
you.
Bye-bye.